Last Night in Soho has so much to offer, including incredible visuals, a unique style and aesthetic, captivating performances, a roller coaster of a plot. But it also leaves you with an unsettled, haunted feeling that gives you so much to digest and think about long after you've finished the movie. So first, before I get into everything, let me do all of my usual disclaimers. So this whole discussion is going to have spoilers, so this is your warning. Also, this video contains my opinions. It's mostly my interpretation of what it all means, and also tidbits of things that I thought were good or bad, and just things that I thought were interesting to bring up. So just keep in mind that this is scattered with my opinions, but also that this is my analysis, so it's definitely not perfect. It's just things that I picked up on and wanted to bring up and ruminate on with others. Also, trigger/content warnings are suicide, sexual violence, addiction, mental illness, sexism. So if you're sensitive to any of those topics, you might want to turn off this video. And without further ado, please watch on to hear my discussion of Last Night in Soho. In order to understand the themes at play, you first need to understand the relationship and parallels between the two main characters, Ellie and Sandie. We see the story through Ellie's eyes. She lives in the present time and moves to London to go to fashion school and start her new life. Eventually, she starts having visions or dreams of Soho in the 1960s involving this girl, Sandie. Sandie is also seemingly new to the city and wants to become a singer. Sandie gets wrapped up in a dark scene which inevitably starts bleeding over into Ellie's life. There's an obvious comparison to be made between the two girls, especially looking at the beginning of their journeys. Dreams of fame and being an artist and moving to the big city to have all these new opportunities and to become discovered. But as their journeys diverge, it's important to look at the circumstances that got each of them to where they ended up. Circumstances both internal with their personalities and strengths, but also external, such as the time period and available support systems. There are two main themes that are central to the story: trauma and escapism. Trauma being this event or experience that forever changes you as a person and lingers in your consciousness. Escapism is the act or tendency of avoiding a situation you may find yourself in. By escaping, you're able to forget about your circumstances and focus on some other happy distraction. I see the relationship between trauma and escapism as being quite circular. One informs the other. I believe the start of the process starts with the trauma, then wanting an escape because of the trauma, and then the escape causing even more trauma, and so on and so on. So let's start with trauma. In the very first scene of the movie, we learn that the main character, Ellie, lives with her grandmother because her mom is dead. Once she arrives at school and starts talking with her floor mates, she reveals that her mom died from suicide. No doubt this has had a detrimental effect on Ellie's life. It's hard to lose anyone in your life, let alone a parent, and at such a young formative age, and in such a sudden and dark manner. We don't know much about how this happened, when this happened, and how Ellie's personality has changed, but it's inevitable that it must have had a significant effect on her. When we first meet Ellie, she seems relatively well-adjusted. She's a normal teenager, young and naive. She loves 1960s culture, and her dream is to become a fashion designer, both of which seem to be ways of connecting to her mother and grandmother. Ellie's mother and grandmother also bonded over making clothes, and Ellie's mother also moved to Soho to get into the fashion industry. Once Ellie moves to London, she has a rough time adjusting to school and making connections with her peers. Her roommate Jocasta is the personification of all the bullying and cruelty she faces at school and in the dorms. When the two girls first meet, Jocasta makes mostly passive-aggressive comments, but pretty soon Ellie overhears Jocasta making fun of her to her friends. Jocasta had basically forced Ellie to reveal the fact that her mom died by suicide, and later claims that Ellie obviously said all that for attention, and that she bets that Ellie will kill herself by the end of the term. This is obviously an insensitive thing to say in general, but is especially tone-deaf and triggering knowing what Ellie has been through with her mother. This relationship and the bullying she endures is a new trauma she faces. As I said, she seems to be well adjusted from her mother's death, but the bullying and isolation is just more trauma to add to the list of struggles she has to go through. And this is probably a good place to mention that I'm using a very flexible definition of trauma. The story portrays a wide variety of trauma. It ranges from suicide, as I've said, as well as sex work and drug, alcohol abuse, as we'll see later on, to more minor things like bullying. I just wanted to acknowledge here that, of course, there's levels to each type of trauma, and some are worse than others. But even more minor traumas like bullying can still cause a lifelong negative impact. Now that we've established the trauma that Ellie deals with, let's talk about what comes next, the escapism. From the very beginning of the movie, we know that she is obsessed with everything 1960s, and that obsession seems at least partially to do with the loss of her mother. Whether it's trying to connect to an older generation, or whether it's just a hyperfixation to distract her from the more depressing elements of her life. As she tries to adjust to new life at college, we see her fail to connect with her classmates. Her classmates weren't very warm to begin with, but she also is shy and she seems to be embarrassed by some of her interests. We watched her pack for college, and the first thing she packed was her old records, and then she packed the more practical items. So we know she relies heavily on her music, but when you see her in the dorms, she's listening to her 60s music on her phone with earbuds in. She's hiding it from the rest of the world. She's embarrassed and doesn't want it to further separate her from her peers. One night, she's forced to leave her dorm room and walks into the middle of a party. She's out of it. She's immersed in her own little world with her music until some guy steals her headphones, pulling her out of her safe headspace and making her fully realize the scene that she's in. And he insults her old grandma music while he's at it.
What are you listening to?
Nothing now.
You actually listen to this granny shit? How old are you?
Mate.
Music has always been her safe space, and she's unable to enjoy it out in the open once she's moved to college. She inevitably gets tired of having to live like this, always having to be on her guard, never getting to relax, always feeling like the freak of the class. So when she sees an ad for an apartment, she is interested. When she goes to see the apartment, the landlady asks why she's interested, and Ellie replies that she just wants an escape. And the landlady says, "Don't we all?"
You're not in any trouble, are you?
No. No, I just need an escape.
Oh, don't we all, dearie?
This is hinting at the overall theme of escapism, or just outright telling you about the theme, but it's also foreshadowing this desire that we see within Sandie later on. She agrees to rent the room, and as soon as she moves in, we see her allow herself to be free again by allowing herself to take up space and listen to her records out loud. So at this point, she has quite literally escaped from her situation at school with her classmates. Now that she's at her new apartment, she escapes even further through having these dreams or visions involving Sandie. This is where I'd say it starts circling back into trauma again. The escape is good for a while, both in real life because she's able to do what she wants without judgment, but also because she is living vicariously through these visions of Sandie. But pretty quickly, the dreams turn to nightmares, and this starts bleeding into her reality. She starts doing research into Sandie's murder, she starts seeing Sandie in real life. Regardless of whether these visions are real or not, they do take over Ellie's life pretty quickly. And it also doesn't matter whether the dream or escape is good or bad, because it takes over her life the same way. She has the trauma with her mom, of course, but also has the more recent and active trauma regarding her isolation from her peers. She has trouble getting along with her classmates, so she gets an apartment to avoid them rather than trying to find new friends or standing up to her bullies. And when John asks her if she has plans one day, she says she does, even though those plans strictly involve her going back to her dream world with Sandie. Once the dream world with Sandie starts turning ugly, it starts taking over her real life in other ways. She starts researching into Sandie's death. She's haunted by the memory of Jack and the other creepy guys Sandie was subjected to. She starts having episodes, imagining things and making scenes, screaming in class and once almost killing a classmate. So when the dreams are good, she actively turns down opportunities she gets in her real life that could help her resolve this recent trauma. When the dreams are bad, it starts haunting her in real life. And this is why I see it as being this cycle. It starts with the trauma, which causes the need for an escape. Escapism prevents you from actually addressing the original trauma and eventually makes things worse in the end. Up until this point, I've pretty much just focused on Ellie's side of the story. Ellie moves into this old apartment building and starts having dreams about this girl named Sandie, who lived there in the 1960s. It turns out that these visions or dreams are more like flashbacks, looking into the life and events of this girl who really existed, Sandie. Sandie wants to be a singer, and the first time we see her, she is confidently storming into presumably the biggest club in Soho and asking for a singing gig, having had no prior experience. She's referred to Jack, who seems to be some kind of manager or authority figure. She gets wrapped up in a whirlwind romance with him. He defends her honor that first night and gains her trust. The next time they meet, he gets her an audition and gig at a decent club, and her journey just gets worse from there. We see her perform at her first gig, and it's not what anyone expected. She's in the background. It's more of a striptease burlesque-ish number. It seems way shadier than it was supposed to be. And we see Sandie's dream begin to shatter when we see her backstage. Backstage, we also see the horrors that the other girls are experiencing, foreshadowing what's to come for Sandie. In the beginning, Jack tries to convince Sandie to sleep with these important men to further her career. A sleep your way to the top sort of mentality. But eventually it turns into Jack just pimping her out. Sandie entertains endless men and never actually performs again. Her trauma is being coerced and trapped into doing sex work, and her escape becomes alcohol and drugs. She relies on these things as a coping mechanism. She also has other ways of escaping, like dissociating and using other names with these men to try and separate this persona from her true self. We watch her become numb and hopeless. One night, we see Jack threaten her and say she can never leave, which is when she then kills him. So I think it's fair to say that not only is she mentally trapped in this position, but she's also physically trapped. This is a significant point in Sandie's character development. Now she feels empowered to do this to all of her patrons. She starts killing them and hiding the bodies in her apartment floors and walls. I think the escapism got her to this point. She couldn't handle the situation she was in, so tried to cope any way she could, which led to her feeling more and more hopeless and isolated and disconnected from her true self and independence, to a point where she thinks that killing her customers will actually help her situation. Of course, it doesn't really help, but ends up haunting her for the rest of her life, thus exemplifying the trauma cycle that I propose. Ellie and Sandie each have different types and amounts of trauma, but handle it the same way, through escapism. Ellie's escapism starts out innocently enough with her dreams that turn into nightmares, whereas Sandie's escapism is from more of a survival instinct, finding any way to numb the pain. This trauma escapism cycle is emphasizing the need to find another way of addressing trauma. I think a certain amount of escapism is definitely healthy and can help your mental health. I think it becomes an issue when it starts to negatively interfere with your real life. It also depends on the severity and urgency of the trauma, of course, but I wanted to say all of that to make sure that I'm not coming off as victim blaming. I don't want it to seem like I'm saying that Sandie didn't try hard enough to get out of her situation, for example. I'm just examining the sequence of events and what event potentially leads to another and compounds the trauma. I think it's all to say, try your best to address your situation. Don't try to avoid it, but face it head on. And again, of course, some situations aren't as easy as put your mind to it and you can do anything. There are so many factors at play for why people find themselves in certain situations and how likely it is that they can recover. Again, I want to be clear, I'm not trying to victim blame at all or saying that these problems can all be addressed with a certain mindset, but I think these themes are just examining the dangers of going down certain paths. We've talked about each of the girls' stories and introduced the trauma they endure, and how they first choose to address, avoid, or cover up that trauma. Now I want to dig a little bit deeper into these themes. First, I want to talk about what escapism represents, or what it could mean in a more realistic setting. As we explore with Sandie and her story, she escapes with alcohol and drugs to try and cope with her situation that is pretty inescapable otherwise. If need be, she doesn't even need alcohol. She can just dissociate and zone out to prevent living through even more trauma. Ellie escapes literally by getting an apartment away from her bullies, but her escape is also dreaming and living vicariously through Sandie. Sandie's story translates pretty literally into alcohol, substance addiction, and abuse. In real life, alcohol and substance abuse can be common responses to trauma. Escapism has always existed through traditional stories, then books, then movies, but in the current day, escapism reaches a whole new level with accessibility to mobile phones and the internet. Because Ellie's escapism is so immersive, it seemed to draw the biggest comparison to escapism through social media or virtual reality. It seems similar to something like Ready Player One, where people start to live for virtual reality rather than reality. Spending real money on virtual money, or virtual costumes and cosmetics for an avatar, a fake version of yourself. Ellie becomes obsessed with living as Sandie. John asks her out, and she declines because she is looking forward to her dream life, which all just seems very similar to online spaces and virtual reality. There also seems to be a social media parallel as well, specifically with creating this social media persona. Sandie is a real person with real memories and events that happened, but when Ellie dreams, she is dreaming as Sandie. She becomes obsessed with living this glamorous life that Sandie lives in the beginning of the story. She starts bringing pieces of the dream back into her reality. She repeats clever lines that Sandie said.
Least I can do is drive you home.
What's the most?
Well, it's the least I could do.
What's the most? I don't know why I said that. I thought it'd sound cool.
She cuts and dyes her hair just like Sandie's. She buys an expensive vintage coat that is just like Sandie's. She tries to recreate one of Sandie's dresses in her fashion class. All of this seems to parallel our experiences with social media, creating this online persona of who you are, creating this perfect image that you want people to believe you are. There are so many tricks people can use to play up or flat out lie about appearances on social media, using filters, using photo tricks or angles to look a certain way, flexing your vacations or fancy clothes or purses, and showing the best parts of your life and hiding the worst. And then it comes back to haunt you. You have to keep up appearances to match the tone you set on social media. You feel the pressure to lose weight to look more like the photoshopped picture that you posted. You feel insecure about your unfilled lips because you look so much better in photos with all the filters on. You can't tell anyone that your marriage is on the rocks because you only post loving couples photos online. It compounds on itself. It gets harder to live without adhering to these expectations. It gets harder to get back to reality, not just because of the pain of addressing the issue, but also because sometimes it's just fun to live this alternative version of life. As I discussed earlier, the escapism is a cycle, but social media can be a cycle as well. The cycle of keeping up appearances with what you present to the public. And I think this is perfectly exemplified in a conversation between Ellie and her grandmother when Ellie is packing up for college. She has an old picture of her mom and her grandmother when her mom moved to London to go to school. They took a picture outside a fancy restaurant, and Ellie says something like, "When you come visit me, we can go out to this fancy restaurant again." And the grandma says, "Oh no, we never actually ate there. We couldn't afford it. So we just took a picture outside of the fancy restaurant." Just like on social media, people will flex a one-time purchase like it's a common thing, or even fake going on a private jet just for the photo op, similar to what Ellie's mom and grandmother did. And this is all not to shame them, but just to say it's a common human response, this need to fit in, and this escapism to try and pretend like everything's fine when it's not. To summarize, the girls' experience seemed to directly apply to social media being a form of escapism, and like Ellie's virtual reality dreams, isn't really addressing the root of the problem. I think the movie is also saying that these escapes, code for addictions, have a real impact on life. People may keep their two lives separate, but they always find a way to bleed over. The girls' stories consistently show the lines being blurred of what is the dream or escape and what's reality, especially with Ellie's story and her drawing such huge inspiration from Sandie, but also with her living in Sandie's old apartment and physically seeing all the ghosts around in her daily life. The film does such a good job of showing how Ellie's escape of dreaming about Sandie backfires, how it goes from glamour to darkness, how it starts encroaching into her reality and negatively affecting her day-to-day life. This is another reason why I see the escape as a code for various types of addiction, any kind of addiction, how it can initially be meant as an innocent escape but can eventually come back to bite you. Even with addictions that may seem relatively harmless, like addiction to phones or shopping. In the first dream sequence, Ellie, who is dreaming as Sandie, has a heavy makeout sesh with Jack. When Ellie wakes up in the morning, she has a hickey in real life too. I think this was intended to further blend the worlds, what's real and what's not, and also to bolster the idea of addictions having a tangible effect on your more mainstream life. Now I want to examine the differences between the two girls regarding how they each got in their bad positions, and also how they did or didn't get out of it. Each of the two girls gets thrown into these really bad situations. I think one thing that's really important to acknowledge is the different types of support each of the girls had. I think their support systems played a significant hand in what happened to each of them. From what we see, Sandie has no one to turn to, no one to save her once she gets stuck. Once, a police officer tries to convince her to leave as if it were that easy, and he doesn't actually offer any meaningful resources to her. He just says that she is too good for this.
You're too good for this, Sandy. Pretty little thing like you laying in the gutter.
Whereas Ellie has a close relationship with her grandmother. She does lie to her grandmother and say that everything's fine when it's really not, but she does have that constant grounding tool. There's also a comparison to make here to Ellie's mother, who walked a similar path before her. She also journeyed to London for fashion school and had a close relationship with her mother, Ellie's grandmother. She was too proud to ask her mother for help or to be vulnerable in showing her struggles, and ended up dying of suicide. And Ellie's grandmother is especially cautious after this. She tells Ellie over and over again, "Don't be afraid to ask for help." And Ellie is a little bit better about sharing her feelings. She does lie for a bit, saying everything's perfect, but eventually breaks down and shares her true experiences. I think having Ellie's mother's tragic story is specifically told to show what could have happened to Ellie if she didn't ask for help, and what did happen to Sandie because she didn't have any help. I think another important group of characters to keep in mind are the men that the girls get tangled up with. Not only does Sandie not have a support system, but she also had the worst luck imaginable and happened to cross paths with the local pimp. On her first night in town, we see Sandie walk into the club trying to get a job as a singer. The bartender directs her to talk to Jack. Jack puts on this whole show in the beginning to manipulate her and win her trust. That first night, he fights off a man who calls her names, and Sandie is swept off her feet. Something that I assume was all just a ploy to show Sandie that Jack has her best interests at heart. He gets her first gig and slowly indoctrinates her into sex work. This manipulation all subtly starts even by the first gig, implying that it's a big solo gig when actually she's a backup singer-dancer doing the same thing as everyone else, dancing for a room full of mostly men in scant clothing. The girls are also all wearing a wind-up key, which especially alludes to the goal of making them all homogenous and controllable. This is the start of taking her worth away, making her feel not special, like she doesn't deserve something more, which is what leads her to her hopelessness, and how she doesn't even try to get out after a certain point. Jack gains her trust and then slowly takes more and more advantage of her. At one point, we see Sandie see Jack grabbing and kissing another girl, and she doesn't even care. She's already trapped in the system now and realizes it was all a scheme of Jack's. Jack's character is in stark contrast to John's character, where Sandie gets wrapped up with Jack, who pulls her down. Ellie gets wrapped up with John, who continually lifts her up. From the very beginning, John is very friendly and supportive of Ellie. He always checks in on her and strikes up conversations and eventually asks her on dates. He is supportive and encouraging of her schoolwork and art. It takes a while for her to warm up to him in return, but she does start to open up to him as the story moves along. He's honestly too good for this earth. Ellie puts him through some pretty bad, traumatizing situations, and he's always still there for her, expecting nothing in return. The two girls also have two very different ends, which I think thematically has to do with how they chose to deal with their trauma. Ellie's ending is much happier. She has resolved the trauma that occurred over the film's runtime. She has a successful fashion show at school, and John and her grandmother are there to support her. Sandie has a much more tragic ending. Let's rewind a little and talk about what happens in the last few scenes. Ellie saw in a vision that Jack murdered Sandie, which made her go to the police. The police later came by the apartment and started asking questions. We find out that Ellie's old landlady is the grown-up version of Sandie. Old Sandie reveals what actually happened, which is that she killed Jack and then started killing off her other customers. Sandie revealed this all to Ellie, and now the police are asking questions, so Sandie tries to kill Ellie. A fire was accidentally set, and Sandie ends up dying in the fire. Sandie lived through this extremely traumatic situation. She felt so small and hopeless that she thought she had no way out of it, and by killing these men, she put herself in an even worse situation that ended up haunting her forever. Not only figuratively, but also literally, since she couldn't leave this building where she experienced so much pain. She couldn't ever sell the building, otherwise people might discover what she'd done, which is why she ends up dying in the fire. She says, "I don't want to go to prison. I've been in prison all my life."
I'm not going to prison. I've been in a prison all my life.
This has always haunted her. She's never been able to heal from what happened and move on. Her coping mechanism was again escaping and dissociating. She says that the old her died that day. She sees that version of herself as a different person than the person she is today. This transition is not only the end of her innocence and the death of her hopes and dreams, but is also the transition between a woman who is being taken advantage of and a woman who took the power back. And then even later, to someone who is so disconnected and so dissociated from that trauma that it seems like another person, another lifetime. Ellie runs into old Sandie at various points in the film, and they talk about the 60s, since Ellie's new haircut and coat are 60s inspired, and old Sandie says later on that this inspired her to get back into some of her old hobbies, listening to her old records and smoking. I think this shows how she tried to distance herself from that old life, the good and bad, anything that reminded her of that traumatic era. Sandie has a rule that no men are allowed in the building at night. One night, when Ellie sneaks John over and she starts having an episode, having visions of the faceless men, old Sandie hears and eventually breaks into the room. No one is able to see the ghosts or the visions other than Ellie, not even Sandie, who is the one that this trauma stemmed from. At the end, when the building is on fire, The men now have faces, and Sandie can see them because she has been starting to acknowledge that old part of her life. Ellie is able to heal and move on from her trauma, especially because of her experience with Sandie. She saw how Sandie had grown old without ever properly healing. She saw what happens when you escape and dissociate from your experiences rather than addressing it head on. Sandie became defined by her trauma. Ellie saw how Sandie's whole life was restricted, both emotionally and physically because of the hidden bodies, all because of this one era of her life. I think she also learned some lessons from some of the other characters in the story as well. From her mother, she learns not to bottle the trauma up. She learns how important it is to rely on others when needed. Her bully, Jocasta, has also had her own trauma, with her mother dying of cancer. Perpetrators are often victims themselves, so I think her experience with Jocasta shows the importance of breaking the trauma cycle. Just because something bad happened to you doesn't mean that you are justified in treating other people a certain way, or justifies you acting like a victim. The realization of the importance of letting go of your past trauma was all symbolized by Ellie watching the picture of her mom burn in the house fire. The movie is definitely also commenting on romanticizing past generations. I think we all have the habit of doing this, saying, "Oh, I wish I lived back in the 80s, it must have been so cool back then." Nostalgia plays tricks on our brains, making it seem like things must have been better than they actually were, because somehow it all seems so magical that we don't even consider how much worse it must have been, without all of the recent medical and technological advances, for instance. Like, you may say that you'd want to live back in the 1950s, but would you really want to go back to a time where you don't have a cell phone? Probably not. And this doesn't even keep in mind all of the social progress that's been made for people of marginalized identities. There's this older woman bartender that Ellie works for, and she says at one point that the bar only has good memories, which is probably not true, since we've seen what happened with Sandie and the other girls of past time periods. This is a common sentiment, but who knows whether it's wishful thinking or ignorant optimism. The two time periods are also important in showing the women's experiences that have changed over the years, or most notably, that have remained the same. Speaking of support systems, there would have been little to no welfare services, legal recourse, mental health services that Sandie could have utilized back in the 1960s. We never saw Ellie utilize the help of a mental health professional, but she seems to be more aware of the importance of mental health, whether because of the time period where mental health discourse is more prevalent, or whether it's because of her past trauma with her mother's death. One thing that didn't age well between the two generations is the police. Ellie goes to the police to tell them about the vision she had of Sandie's death. She meets with two police officers, one is a woman and one is a man. The policeman obviously thinks she's crazy, and Ellie later hears him making fun of her to his male co-workers. The policewoman doubts Ellie's story, but treats her more compassionately. Where the male police officer asks Ellie if she was on drugs, the female police officer suggests that maybe someone drugged her. And the policewoman is the one that takes this claim seriously and later investigates and checks in with Ellie's landlady. And this definitely plays into another theme in the film, which is believing women, and a sort of automatic camaraderie that only exists between women. But going back to the police topic for a minute, if this was Ellie's experience with police in the modern day, imagine how it must have been for Sandie, and how much more trapped she must have felt. Ellie's only chance of being taken seriously was through her conversation with the female cop. Sandie is stuck with male cops that aren't going to take her seriously, which is what we see with Lindsay, the male cop who works in Vice. He says he wants to help her, but he's kind of weirdly hitting on her at the same time. He's judgmental, and he doesn't actually offer any tangible support or advice. We get to see more of him with his interactions with Ellie, and we can see that he's not really a good person, with the objectifying way he talks about women.
She didn't belong. I thought she was too good for it. But you know, at the end of the day, you all look the same on a slab.
You would think he might be a little more sensitive after a lifetime of working with sex workers, but of course not. I also think the personalities of the two girls are very purposeful. Ellie is a shy, meek girl, whereas Sandie is bold and flirtatious, and she uses her sexuality to get what she wants. Traditionally, a character like Sandie will be victim blamed. She deserved it because she was open with her sexuality, whereas Ellie is a nice girl and deserves her happy ending. I also think Sandie's personality type also justifies her feelings of being trapped, because people would have taken her claims less seriously. The police and anyone else who Sandie might have reached out to for help may put the blame back on her. I feel like the movie is challenging these stereotypes by allowing us to sympathize with Sandie and allowing us to see all of the external reasons why she actually got dragged into this. The forever presence of the male gaze is another big thing in this movie. Both of the women are constantly having to navigate being creeped on by men. Ellie's first experience in the city is with this cab driver that makes creepy comments and almost refuses to let her out of the car, and then weirdly waits outside the store for her. The first time we see Sandie in the club, she is also being ogled at by old men. It's always there. Sandie's male victims that haunt Ellie, men watching Sandie's burlesque performance, men creeping on Ellie once she starts doing her hair and becoming more confident. There also was Jack there, who preyed on Sandie almost immediately. I think the film also plays with the idea of it being hard to interpret a man's intentions, whether positive or negative or apathetic. Like during one of Ellie's episodes, she runs through the school and town screaming because of one of her visions, and she is seeing the ghosts in any man around her. Through her eyes, she jumps to the conclusion that they're all just like Jack, just like Sandie's patrons. They're all out to get her. And that's kind of the baseline assumption. Living as a woman, you assume the worst because you don't want to be caught off guard and kidnapped. This paranoia may also explain some of her hesitation to rely on John. One interesting moment in the movie is where the ghost men are chasing Sandie. And there are these ghost zombie things, and they're chasing Sandie, so your brain automatically jumps to the classic zombie eating brains. But the way it's staged and shot, it almost looks like they just want a piece of her, like in a sexual way, or as if she were famous and they were the adoring fans, which I think is just an interesting visualization of the male gaze. As I briefly mentioned earlier, believing women is a theme looking at women's rights or issues affecting women between the two different decades. Ellie's case is maybe the more obvious one to look at with this lens, because she has these visions or dreams. So a constant question you're grappling with is whether she's crazy or whether she's psychic. It's still unclear, but to me it does seem like she has some kind of psychic ability, because otherwise how would she know Sandie's story and have it match up with Sandie's account of things if Ellie had just been making these things up in her head? But regardless of whether these visions are real, her peers and especially the male police officer are all extremely disrespectful and dismissive. Just because they can't see what Ellie sees, there's no physical evidence, they automatically assume she's lying or making it up, which has obvious comparisons to other types of situations where you should believe women. And it all also just plays into the old-timey idea of hysteria and assuming that a woman's valid concern or outburst is a mental breakdown. Lindsay, the vice officer who tried to convince Sandie to leave sex work, is also really dismissive. He basically just says that she's too good for this. This implies that he thinks it was her choice to get into this business. I don't think he would believe her if she shared her perspective about how she was manipulated and preyed upon. Both of the main characters go through traumatic events where they're on this downward spiral where everything just keeps getting worse. The only comfort is feeling the connection between the two women, mostly from Ellie to Sandie, even if she only knows this memory version of her. And that's what makes the end of the movie so moving to me. Even though the old Sandie tries to kill Ellie, Ellie still has this love for Sandie. Sandie's plan is to kill Ellie, and she says that no one will suspect anything. They'll all just think Ellie killed herself because she's crazy, which I think is the pessimism coming out of Sandie based on her own life experiences. When we saw her initially, she's full of light and hope. The older version of her is grumpy and negative. Nobody believed her when she was younger, so she puts that same societal expectation on Ellie, assuming the worst and enforcing the worst, since that's what she was dealt. Sandie is chasing Ellie up the stairs with a knife, meanwhile the house is on fire. Once they get to the top, the ghost men come out and encourage Ellie to kill Sandie to set their spirits free, and she refuses. Ellie understands why Sandie did what she did, and she offers that forgiveness and understanding to Sandie. Ellie tries to save Sandie, but I think for Sandie this forgiveness is too late and she just succumbs to the fire. But the moment between the two girls, who are the only ones who can understand each other, is very moving. Gives them both a moment to heal and just feels true to the spirit of women believing and supporting other women. I think Ellie's visions are also important for this theme of believing women. I think she knows what it's like to feel like a freak and to have these odd, unbelievable things happen to you that no one understands. This power she has seems to be a result of her trauma with her mother. Her mother died in this really traumatic way, and now Ellie has the ability of seeing ghosts, including her mother, and has these visions of Sandie's life. Sometimes her powers play out very much like PTSD, where she's frozen in the moment due to this memory that feels completely real. Both symbolically and literally, I think this just shows the extent of Ellie's empathy. Literally, because Ellie's powers in this story allow her to see Sandie's traumatic experiences as if they were her own, and symbolically, as another woman who is a trauma survivor, she is naturally more empathetic towards Sandie. That's it for my analysis of Last Night in Soho. There are still a few other themes that the film touches on, but this video was already getting too long, so I decided to just focus on some of the themes that were more interesting and rich to me. I think the movie has a lot to say in its 2-hour runtime. It's a very rewatchable movie for me, not just because of the themes and rich content, but also because of the captivating atmosphere and performances. It's not perfect, but it's a movie that definitely stuck with me for a while after I watched it. So that's it. Let me know your thoughts on the movie, and let me know your thoughts on some of the things I pointed out, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!